My friend Takeshi works as a night security guard at Keio University's main library in Tokyo. He told me this story last month. His hands were still shaking. It was a Tuesday night in November around 2:30 a.m. The library had been closed for hours. Takeshi heard footsteps on the third floor. Slow, deliberate steps moving between the stacks. He grabbed his flashlight and climbed the stairs. The third floor housed the historical archives, documents dating back centuries. As he reached the top, the footsteps stopped. Complete silence. But then he heard pages turning. The sound was coming from the restricted section. Takeshi followed the sound, his beam cutting through the darkness. There, at a reading table, sat a figure in traditional robe. An elderly woman reading by candlelight that cast no shadows. The book in her hands was written in characters that seemed to move. Takeshi cleared his throat. "Excuse me, the library is closed." She looked up slowly. Her eyes were completely white. "I am the librarian here," she whispered in ancient Japanese. "I have been reading this same page for 300 years. Takeshi's flashlight began to flicker. When the light steadied, she was gone. But the book remained open on the table. The page was blank, except for fresh, wet stains. Tears. The next morning, Takeshi researched the library's history. In 1724, a librarian named Sachiko had died while cataloging ancient. She had been found at her desk, still holding a book that no one could read and no one could close. Every night since then, Takeshi sees the candlelight flickering on the third floor, but he never goes upstairs anymore. Some books are never meant to be finished. This happened to my cousin Yuki when she was a graduate student in Kyoto. She was researching folklore at the city's oldest public library. The building dated back to the Meiji period, all dark wood and narrow corridors. One evening, she was the last person there. The elderly librarian Tanaka-san was locking up. "Be careful with the old book," he warned her. "Some of them don't like being disturbed." Yuki found it amusing until she discovered the book. It was bound in strange leather, no title on the cover. Inside, stories of vengeful spirits written in beautiful calligraphy. Perfect for her research. She checked it out, but there was no due date stamp. The card was yellowed with age. The last name was from 1953. That night, Yuki took the book to her apartment. She read until dawn, completely absorbed. The stories seemed to speak directly to her. But when she tried to return it the next day, something was wrong. Tanaka-san stared at the book in horror. This book, it was lost decades ago. The person who borrowed it, he never returned. He showed Yuki an old newspaper clipping. A young woman had gone missing in 1953, last seen leaving the library. They had found her weeks later in the mountains. She had been writing endlessly, in her own blood. "The book chooses its readers," Tanaka-san whispered, "and it doesn't let them go." That night, Yuki tried to sleep, but she heard whispering. The book was calling to her from the living room. She found it open on her coffee table, pages turning by themselves. New stories were appearing, stories about her. In the margin, someone had written in faded ink, "Welcome to the collection." Yuki managed to burn the book the next morning. But sometimes, she still hears the whispering. And in every library she visits, she sees her name on a waiting list. Some books never forget their readers. Hiroaki was a medical student at Tohoku University in Sendai. During exam season, he practically lived in the library. His favorite spot was study room 304, always empty, always quiet, perfect for long nights of cramming. The room was tucked away on the third floor, isolated from the main library. One night in December, Hiroaki was studying for his anatomy final. It was past midnight, the building was supposed to be empty, but he heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate, stopping right outside his door. Hiroaki looked up from his textbook. The door handle was turning. A figure in a white coat entered, moving stiffly. Another medical student, he assumed. The figure sat at the opposite table, pulled out identical textbook. But something was wrong. The student never turned pages, never moved, just stared at the same page for hours. Hiroaki tried to focus on his study, but he kept glancing up. The figure's white coat was stained with something dark, and there was a smell, formaldehyde mixed with decay. Around 3 a.m., Hiroaki couldn't take it anymore. "Excuse me," he whispered. The figure slowly looked up. Its face was pale, eyes sunken, skin like wax. "Studying for final," asked in a hollow voice. Hiroaki nodded, too terrified to speak. I've been studying for 60 years, the figure continued. Failed my final exam in 1963, never got to graduate. But I keep trying every night in this room. Hiroaki packed his books quickly, hands shaking. Where are you going? The figure asked. We could study together forever. Hiroaki ran from the room, never looking back. The next day, he asked about study room 304. The librarian looked confused. Room 304 was sealed 20 years ago. A student died there, stress-induced heart failure during final. They found him at his desk, still clutching his pen. Hiroaki never studied late again, but sometimes walking past the third floor, he still hears pages turning behind the sealed door. My sister Akane worked as a part-time librarian in Nara. The library was old, built in the 1920s during the Taisho period. Beautiful but unsettling, especially the basement archive. Students rarely ventured down there, too cold, too quiet. Akane's job was to reshelve returned books every evening. She didn't mind the solitude until the whispering started. It began during her third week, soft voices between the staff. At first, she thought it was the ventilation system, but the sounds were too organized, like conversations in a language she couldn't understand. One Thursday evening, the whispering grew louder. Akane followed the sound deeper into the archive, row after row of dusty books, some so old they crumbled at her touch. The voices seemed to come from the books themselves. She pulled one from the shelf, a diary from the Edo period. As soon as she opened it, whispering stopped. Complete silence. Then, a single voice spoke from the book in her hands. Please read my story. The voice was desperate, pleading. Akane began to read aloud, a tale of a merchant's daughter. As she read, more voices joined in from other books. A chorus of forgotten stories, begging to be heard. Akane realized the truth. These weren't just books. They were prisons, souls trapped in their own written words. People who had died while writing, their spirits bound to the page. She tried to leave. The voices grew frantic. Don't abandon us. Finish our story. Books began falling from the shelves, pages fluttering like wings. The basement filled with a hurricane of desperate voices. Akane ran for the stairs, but they were blocked. A wall of floating books, pages open like hungry mouths. Join us, they whispered. Write with us forever. Akane found a pen on the floor, her hand moving against her will. She began writing her own story on a blank page, but at the last moment, she threw the pen away. The voices screamed, the books crashed to the floor. Akane escaped, but she quit the next day. Sometimes she still dreams of those voices, calling her back to finish what she started. This story was told to me by an old professor at Waseda University. He swore it was true, though his voice trembled when he told it. In 1987, he was a young graduate student researching Japanese literature. The university library had a special collection room, always locked. Only senior faculty had access, and they rarely used it. One night, working late on his thesis, he noticed the door was open. Curious, he peered inside. The room was magnificent, walls lined with ancient text, manuscripts that predated the university itself. At the center sat an ornate reading table, lit by a single lamp, and there, someone was reading. An elderly man in traditional robes, completely absorbed in his book. The professor assumed it was a visiting scholar. He cleared his throat politely. "Excuse me, sensei." The man looked up slowly. His face was ancient beyond measure. Eyes like deep wells, skin like parchment. "Ah, student," the man smiled. "Come, sit with me." Something in his voice compelled obedience. The professor found himself sitting at the table. "I am reading the most fascinating text," the man continued. "The complete history of this university, including its future." He showed the professor the open page. It described every student who had ever studied here and ever would. "See here," the man pointed. "This is you." The professor read his own name, his birth date, his entire life story, including details he had never told anyone. "And here," the man turned the page, "is your death." The professor tried to look away, but the words described him dying in this very room tonight. "Who are you?" the professor whispered. "I am the first librarian of this university," the man replied. "I died here in 1882, but my work is not finished." I must catalog every soul who enters these halls. The professor felt his strength fading, his life force draining away. The book was pulling him in, making him part of the collection. But then, the morning bell tower chimed. The spell broke. The professor fled the room. When he looked back, the door was locked again. He never spoke of it for 30 years. But now, as he approaches the age written in that book, he can hear the librarian calling his name. Soon, he will return to finish his end.